Welcome back, everyone, to this Oral History podcast series, A Journey Through the Past, Present, and Future of Mining. I'm Priscilla Nelson, your host, and joining me as always is my co-host, Mónica Ospina. Today, we're diving into the heart of sustainability and explore its origins, evolution, and the many layers of complexity that come with us. Our guests, Sigurdson and Luke Danielson, will be guiding us through a rich discussion that starts with the Brundtland Commission's groundbreaking work and moves through the tangled web of environmental, social, and economic challenges that face the mining industry today.
Today's conversation touches on some of the most important foundational aspects of sustainability, from the Human Development Index to global standards, and the difficult balance between local decision-making and global issues like climate change. Luke and Glenn stressed the importance of inclusivity in decision-making was vital for achieving sustainable development at the local level. Their insights are invaluable for understanding not just where we come from, but also where we headed in the ongoing journey towards sustainable development in mining. It's going to be an eye-opening discussion.
There's no question that Rio Conference and the Brundtland Commission kind of were a package, but the ignition for the conference was the World Commission on the Environment, headed by former Prime Minister Bro Brundtland. It was fascinating to read kind of the introductory paragraphs that I reread again, and I think I touched on it earlier, but it's worthwhile coming back to it. What she was saying was that there was huge pressure to focus the entire energy onto something that was more capable of being calibrated, like environment. She recognized the critical importance of including within that social, because it was human actions and activities that would ultimately determine environmental outcomes, and that you can't speak in any kind of way about the complexity of environment, economy, and society without all three being talked about together. It was really recognizing the notion of the interdependency that was critical to moving forward. And the first words that were given to sustainable development, the first definition, was really about understanding it from an equitable point of view as well, intergenerational equity, enabling future generations to continue to enjoy the fruits of the earth the way those of us who've been before them have also been able to enjoy them. It's interesting, though, at that time, development was very much focused on economic development. I think it's become a more fulsome word as we went forward into a more holistic view of what development meant. But there was a lot of pressure in the environmental movement, particularly here in British Columbia, which was quite a hotbed. We had many major global world-class environmental issues going on around the late 1980s, including a massive park called South Moresby that we've spoken about before on the Pacific coast, close to Alaska and British Columbia. And in that context, there was this sense that it was tilting the scale in favor of economic development, and we needed to invent this term sustainability. And as we've talked about since then, it was very interesting to appreciate that it has spun a much more imprecise application of the term, because everything is sustainable today. There's sustainable this, sustainable business, sustainable community, sustainable government, on and on it goes. And I think part of this whole evolution that we've seen with these proliferation of acronyms, all these new terms like social license, we've seen a proliferation of terms around standards and norms. All of this has gradually been tearing away at the holistic fabric that was envisioned by Brundtland. And I think that requires us, as we go forward in these conversations, to revisit the extent to which we go forward into the future by looking backward. And I think we do need to draw to grips with what are we doing and what are we trying to measure in all of these standards against that backdrop. that's kind of my opening comment on this whole area of sustainability and sustainable development. Is it back to the future, and is the only way to really assess where we've come in the utility and pragmatism of these standards and norms and whatever other terms we want to attach to this whole arena? Are they meeting the tests that were originally contemplated in terms of the interdependency of the factors that we're driving? Because it was really about changing the view of the interface between private and public. Now we were suggesting that there was needed to be taken into account in decision making at all levels other factors than straight economic variables. So in a way, it was about a new definition of what decision making with credibility going forward would require at all levels by all people, whether it was governments, companies, communities, whatever. So this should be a benchmark that we should be able to measure everything against, in my view. And I don't think we've done that yet.
There's really a lot in your comment, Glenn. And one thing I would say is there has been a movement away from what I learned as a young student of economics years ago, where basically everything that happened that was measured in money was important, and everything else was sort of shuffled off and called an externality. And one of the things we have learned is that a lot of the things that aren't directly measured in money are, in fact, incredibly important. And just sort of brushing them off as externalities is not very useful. I'm very, very fond of the work of Amartya Sen, the driving force behind the Human Development Index. I think the Human Development Index was an incredible step forward, over the old how much money is being shuffled around. One of the great examples of this is all of the research done by development scholars seems to indicate that there's really nothing you could do to try to make our societies, all of them, better off, nothing better than to focus on prenatal care for mothers, neonatal care, early childhood education, and that over time, the positive impacts of investing in those fields is overwhelmingly better than almost anything else you can do, right? Yet the problem is that we still are in a society dominated by flows of cash. And the question is, all right, so we make sure that this little kid has proper nutrition at age 1. In the long run, that person becomes a much more helpful, productive member of society, and the society is really a lot better off. But we can't really tax that, or there's no way to turn it back into a financial flow. So those kind of activities always get underfunded. But I really like the of course, there are other indices that have been developed, the gender-based development index, which I think is great. And, the research seems to indicate that basic measures of gender equity correlate really strongly with all the other things we would like. Are girls allowed to go to school? And what's the ratio of little boys to little girls in elementary schools and things like that? Those things tend to identify societies that are succeeding in building value for their citizens. To get back to the sustainability point, I really agree with a lot of what you said. Back in the day, the post-Brundtland day, I remember a number of situations where people were shut down for getting up at meetings and trying to talk about sustainability. And people were saying, what does sustainability mean? It's a vague term. I have no idea what it means. Sustainable development, I can understand. There's a definition. There's actually a whole literature about how to measure sustainable development. Amartya Sen wrote some of it. I did go to a meeting at which some guy got up and He was criticized for using sustainability, and he said, I have to admit that you're right. I've grown up thinking that any form of development destroys the environment. And so I can't be in favor of any form of development because development is what the problem is, right? And so I'm going to use sustainability instead. In the graduate school I've been teaching in up till recently, they now have flavors of sustainability. Would you analyze this from the perspective of economic sustainability? Oh, well, it's socially sustainable. It's environmentally sustainable. And I don't think anybody I honestly have probed, and I don't think people are using those terms have any kind of a rigorous definition.
Let me jump into it in this way. In many ways, sustainability is about, can we find ways to live and work together across differences of value, of interest, and power? Can we do that? Now, that seems like a very lofty question, and it certainly is lofty as you take it up into the stratosphere of indexes, standards, norms, etc. But they're just like a looming dark cloud to me that kind of looms over the globe and the watersheds and the river systems and the landscapes. And it's like cookie cutters coming down, clutching, wanting to define the world in their own ways. They're going to pocket it out. It's a bit like Richard dividing the world up for MMSD. We'll put China and Australia and Africa together, and we'll do this and we'll do that. The fact is that sustainability is best understood at ground zero, where real people work, real people live, real people are trying to find ways to live together and work together across differences in value. It is the marketplace, in effect, at the ground, where real people are confronting how they're going to trade values across different currencies. If you take fish, it's an ideal example. There's aesthetics connected with the watersheds. There's a recreational aspect. There's food connected. There's other kind of sources. There's a long history and indigenous connections to fish. If you can work on fish problems, you can pretty well work on anything because it's got everything in it. And these folks that are living and working in that environment, they have to trade across values because the fish are coming. And you have an immediate urgency each year to find ways of dealing with issues of conservation and allocation. And it seems to me, in my world, I like to drill up, not drill down, because I believe that we can only make sense of what sustainability means in a profound and real sense when you have the opportunity for different voices to interact with those values and interests. And they then have to reach some kind of a point of balance where they can coexist in spite of their differences. We're not trying to make them the same. And so when we first started to work on the round table across Canada to develop those principles, it was because of all the furriness connected with trying to define this term. Everybody's running around defining it. There's books, there's policy manuals. It was a dizzying place for policy shops and academics and anybody who wanted to venture into the field. But we said, no, this is about drilling the world down to the place where real people are interacting around real problems and trying to build a relationship sufficient that they're able to manage life at their level in their place so that they can coexist. And in that sense, those principles to me that came forward with the authenticity of being developed across the country from many points of view and interests were kind of like a foundation to jumpstart these conversations in different places across the country. Now, once we start getting down to that, we start getting down into what is the essence of sustainability. It's building a sustainable relationship, because if you can build a sustainable relationship, including ways of resolving differences, you'll reach sustainable outcomes. You cannot talk about sustainability, in my view, other than by talking about the way in which we make complex decisions that take into account those balances. And as long as we've stayed up in the atmosphere, we've lost sight of what the ground is all about. So that's kind of the way I see it. And I don't think we have any standards that are actually authenticating the success of different players and giving guidance other than those principles that I know of as to how that should be done.
Well, there's one principle that I think is key to this discussion, and I think that's the principle of subsidiarity. And subsidiarity is an idea that has come out of the Jesuit order over the last several centuries. And, the question is, if a decision needs to be made, where do we make it?
Right.
Does someone in Rome make the decision and tell everyone in the world how to act? And that principle, which I must say I was really introduced to in depth by Richard Sandbrook, is that everything should be handled at the lowest possible level. And that is defined by the level at which all of the parties that have a serious interest in the outcome can be brought to the table, right? So there are some issues that can't be dealt with in a particular river valley that have to be province-wide, or issues that can't be dealt with at the provincial level that are really have to be dealt with at the national level. Hopefully, instead of the approach of the authoritarian societies that try to do everything at the top and push it down, a society that really does decentralized decision making will be more successful in the long run. I do say there are some decisions that have to be made at a very high level. We can't solve the problem of destruction of the ozone layer without involving really a lot of people. And probably the biggest example of this is climate change, right? There are things we can do about climate change here in my backyard or in the community I live in, but there are elements of the climate change problem that really require collaboration at the highest level. So there needs to be sort of a nested set of dialogues from the local to the regional to the national to global.
Totally agree. I would put it slightly differently, though. In any context where there's a conversation going on at a river basin or a landscape or a coastal region, the question is who needs to be at that table. And I guess the obvious thing is when it comes to matters on which the implementation of any outcome that might be reached by those folks has to be implemented, those who are responsible for implementing it should be at the table as well. So what I'm saying is, and that's what we concluded in our guiding principles, the government had to be at the table. They had to be saying, this won't fly. And we needed to have a direct involvement, not in the sense that those bureaucrats that were there would override a parliamentary or a superior decision-making, but if all of those different players, including the government, came to the table with an outcome, the likelihood is that as a political, but not a legal reality, that outcome would be embraced. Why would it not be? And so this is really a way of managing what is in the public interest, of taking into account that very question that your fellow was saying, why in the hell should I be listening to these folks that are representing only one small community when I represent the whole province or with the whole territory, whatever? In a way, this is a way of managing the fact that we are dealing with distinct minorities that have to be taken into account to build some kind of a future together. So I agree with you. And there's no clearer thing in fishing than the scales in which the decision has to be taken, because the fish are migrating. They're migrating at many levels, but that all has to be part of the context in which that table is coming to grips with it, because basically the problem is always the context around the problem. And that has to be part of the conversation. And it invariably is. It invariably is, in my experience.
And this is a place to go back to the global standards discussion. There are people out there who see global standards as a way of doing an end run around government. And I've heard this expressed pretty vividly by people like big foundations in New York, that, the governments of these developing countries are just such a mess and so dysfunctional and so corrupt that we're going to create this global system of standards as a way of cutting them out of the decision making. I think that's a terrible mistake. I strongly believe that governments, as problematic as they may be, have to be at the table in order to make these things work.
Well, and quite honestly, if you look at it, it makes government work better. Governments are not proactive. Governments tend to be reactive, but if they can find ways of building coalitions of interest that are aligned in some way or another, that gives them a much clearer mandate to act. It's just like if you want to get a government to act, the chances are that by working indirectly, you can achieve what you can't do directly if you're an environmental group or an indigenous community historically, because the power that those corporate structures were able to create if they were your allies, that notion of subsidiarity is such a vitally important one. When you look at what I was just referring to as trying to get onto the local level, I don't mean that local level is not going to be informed contextually both by the involvement of government, because the first question that I always ask in these things, who needs to be part of a deal and who could frustrate its implementation? That's the question. But then the question is, what needs to inform our discussions? And standards, norms, principles, requirements, they all are part of that conversation that needs to take place, whether it's around fish or rocks or wood or whatever it is. And the real point of it is that you're trying to develop the authenticity and the legitimacy of people doing what they promise to do, that we can build commitment to sustainable outcomes. And that's exactly the same as what we were describing with the process that the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA, is trying to do. They're trying to build the same kind of a conversation at a higher altitude level, which is just moving from the ground to the level of the standards plans. And it's trying to give shape to the cloud in a way that everybody has a play as to what colors are going to be in the cloud and how it's going to function and work up above us all. And so, we're really delving into, is the essence of sustainability our ability to find ways to live and work together, and to start focusing on some of those issues, not just these abstract standards and metrics that are convenient to the linear mind, but are very inconvenient to people that have to live in a world of circles and uncertainties and complexities in organizing their life.
The problem is that we need a couple of things. One of them is we need a structure in which those dialogues can take place. We can't just count on there being forward-looking people on both sides of the equation who happen to run into each other and come up with the idea that they should be talking to each other. There needs to be some kind of a structure that encourages the formation of processes for dialogue. We can't just leave it to people to invent that themselves. Someone has to suggest it. Someone has to propose some kind of structure within which it can occur.
I absolutely, but I guess the question is that what Bro Grentland was saying was the challenge? Was she saying that in order to accommodate all these different perspectives and values, we are going to have to create some kind of structures about how we're going to organize ourselves for more effective decision making? Is that really the implications, that you can't really deal with the vision without some kind of recognition of that requirement.
Our proposal at the MMSD project, if you look at our final report, we recognized this idea of subsidiarity and that the preference was for local decision making and all, but also recognized that there were broad global issues that needed a global dialogue and global decisions. And our proposal was really that there be three kind of global parliaments. One of them would be industry. Instead of having hundreds of different companies, we would have a voice for industry that incorporated really a lot of companies. And that's ICMM. That's been done, right? It may have its problems, but there is a global organization that can speak for at least a large part of the global industry. The second part of this was to be a global institution of governments that had the ability to understand the problems of government and be able to come together. And that is, I think, also in existence, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining. Now, I think I saw the notice that they have 85 government members. They're in existence and capable to a large extent of speaking for governments when it comes to mining interests.
Right.
And the third element we had was a civil society organization of human rights organizations, environmental organizations, development organizations that, would develop the credibility to speak for civil society on some very high level. And then, of course, our final piece of that was when we have these three parliaments in place, then there's sort of a global body that has room for representatives of each of them. So you have an industry group that has all kinds of credibility for speaking for industry. You have a government group that can speak for government, and then a broader civil society group that can speak for, and then the three of them get together, and at least on the really big issues like climate change or something, the three of them can talk to each other at a global level. And that was our idea. And I think that the world is taking us in that direction.
But let me challenge that. It sounds to me like that is a potential hairball of bureaucracies, that are going to be fumbling around, incapable of ever reaching their own outcomes given the diversity of interests within any one of them, and incapable of moving to some higher decision-making forum. But what I think has been important out of the conversation is the fact that we have been at both levels, exploring on the ground and up high, and concluding that there is big challenges at both levels. So what is the place that we need to find an equilibrium? In a way, I think we are slowly moving in that direction. But one of the things that, as I understood MMSD's envisioning, was that ICMM would be a multi-sector continuing place to inform the industry broadly. And ICMM quickly migrated after Jay Hare's death into being something very different, an industry organization. There was no longer a secretary general. There was no longer widespread involvement in it, because you recognize, just like its Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, that we needed a place for direct engagement at different levels of these kinds of issues. And we lost that when MMSD ended. And ICMM has done its own good work, and it's tried to inform by incorporation different points of view. But the fact is, it is still an industry organization, and the fact is that you have different people in this massive organization. It basically represents the high end of the pyramid, not all the junior mining companies, where real issues arise on the ground with real people in different places. And don't you think that's a challenge as well?
I never thought that ICMM was going to become a multi-stakeholder body.
Oh, I'm wrong then. I'm sorry, I'm wrong then.
No, I do think, though, that, very much along the lines of what you're saying, that ICMM was going to be much more open to outside opinion. They might have like an independent advisory council or something like that. But Jay Hare told me at one point, I said, what's your plan? And he said, well, we're going to run the ball so far down the field that people can barely see us, and we're going to plant a big flag. And then people say, what are you doing? We're going to say, well, you've agreed to this because you've agreed to the ICMM principles, right? And, he died right in the middle of that process. And it did go backwards. I will say, I think we're back to somebody who has a very similar point of view in Rodawan, the current big chief executive of ICMM. Ro is, he's from civil society. It's interesting to think how many of the chief executives of ICMM have been from environmental organizations or human rights organizations. Anyway, I'm very high on Rodawan and what he's trying to do there, but your statements are exactly on point. And look, ICMM is not a parliament of all interests in mining. It is the big mining companies. It's not the exploration people or even the mining juniors. They've made some headway into getting Chinese membership and things, but the same is kind of true of the Intergovernmental Forum. The Russians aren't playing, and the Chinese are largely not playing. It's a start. And what I wonder is there anything where you see emergence of some kind of a global entity that's capable of bringing together and speaking for civil society organizations?
No, I don't. I think that's there's so many different points of view and so many different human experiences that to find some kind of a global voice that would be acceptable to other voices. They may reflect many common themes, but the question is, would they be respected or have legitimacy? That would be my concern. But it takes us to another point. If we look at this through the lens of real, on the ground risk, whether it's from the community or the company's perspective, the question really comes down to whether or not there is any responsibility that the majors should be taking in terms of managing their food chain, because their food chain is the small explorers that are working around the world to try to source out properties that can become major properties. And if there was standards connected to the due diligence that they were doing in an acquisition of properties or people they were funding, is there ways of managing through the industry itself some of those challenges? Just to pick up the theme of responsibility around the sustainability issue, what obligation does it command internally within structures that are capable of providing some kind of context for the industry?
That's one of the issues, right? And we saw that in the Briex case, something that I was a spectator at, but basically there was a lot of talk about, well, we're just not going. I don't care how good the project is or how much mineral there is in the ground. If some junior has gone out and made a giant mess out of things, we're going to do our due diligence and we're just not going to play. And you looked at that, and by gosh, you had several of the most important executives in the mining industry. They basically started pawing the ground like a bull moose and going for this project without doing any due diligence. I talked to the chief geologist of of Freeport. And he said, we've been telling Jim Bob that, we should, despite how rich all this looks, we should go out there and do some of our own drilling before you lay down $4 billion for this project. And uh, no, there's no time. That John Wilson at Placer Dome or someone will take this away from us if we wait,
I think we've moved long beyond that, because I've been working with companies that have said we need to include in our due diligence how well the juniors that we were acquiring have been managing their community relations. That's one of the things that we don't want to inherit, surprises. And I think there is a sense that is becoming something that is important increasingly, because reputational risk can come flowing in on you in ways that you don't expect. So I think there is a movement that is encouraging companies to do that. And it's also kind of an area where some aspect of the industry that we haven't really talked about, artisanal mining, and the whole area that is also such a zone of potential challenging social environments, but at the same time, an area that we have to uplift into the future, because of the sheer number of people that are one way or another doing that. And I think on that front as well, there's some very positive developments, including market-driven forces that are saying if gold is produced in a certain favorable way out of an artisanal mine, we will prioritize it because we can trace that. We can trace that to a particular place in a particular location, and we're able to do that in a way that has a lot of reputational advantage for us in doing so. So again, it comes down to the connection between what comes out of the ground and the consumer, and the other interest groups that have a stake in civil society or whatever, indigenous society, when watching what's coming out of the ground and being comfortable that it meets their social and moral standards.
We can all hope that things are getting better, but one of the things I'd say is we have the same organization there in PDAC, which has said a lot of really wonderful and very helpful things. And at the same time, who do they invite to speak to their group every year but Bob Friedland?
Right.
And so it's a battle for the soul of the small industry. And those smaller players, there are some really good people out there who are trying to do their best. There are some standards that are coming up, but there's also, an experience I had in Peru with some guy who was a geologist for one of these exploration juniors, and he was telling local villagers some stuff that was just not true. You're all going to get rich. The company's going to shower wealth on you when this comes in. And how can you possibly be saying that? And the answer was, well, that's how we operate as geologists. We could tell them anything we want. Our job is easier if we create these kind of expectations, because then everybody gets out of our way. And I'm not going to be here when the rubber hits the road.
I'm sure that happens, but we have organizations like CIM. We have many very, very capable people that are geologists, and I don't want to paint a broad brush on that, because a lot of geologists are people that work close to the ground, and they understand people on the ground. They live on the ground. They respect nature. So I'm more worried about a kind of an engineering mind that comes in and is constructing and building stuff. Geologists may have their share of warts. There's no profession that doesn't. I'm a recovered lawyer, and I certainly don't want to pretend to be the lawyer. If we get into getting into professional beating, we've got accountants that are now suddenly becoming auditors of social matters, which frightens the hell out of me. We've got engineers with their critical paths that don't understand that there's a human relations path that has to be followed at the same time. And I suspect that if I stack them all up, geologists on the whole are closer to ground zero in understanding what the hell is going on. Now, once they get into some kind of corporate structure, and then I guess that's where money drives it. In order to do their work, they have to go hustle on venture exchanges to get the small pockets of money that they can to enable them to drill and to do their work.
It is not fair to unload all this on any profession. The accountants who want to sit there and say, we can save $5 by screwing this local community are there, and the lawyers who do bad deeds are there. One of my best friends is an exploration geologist who was educated at Colorado School of Mines. And I said, why did you become an exploration geologist? And he said, so I could walk around in beautiful places and never have to talk to anyone.
Well, but I think that's striking at what drives a lot of people into the business of loving rocks. There's no doubt about it. And they love the landscape. They love everything about it. I think they're much more capable of seeing the world from the level, but there's no doubt that I would call it not so much geologists, but the venture capital industry that drives that, because there's no other, financing sources, tends to breed that because they're living on the margins of viability all the time, and they're hoping for the big score at some point. But that's part of the business. It's like being a fisherman. You're hoping for the big haul.
Wow, what an insightful conversation we've had today. Glenn and Luke really shed light on how sustainability has evolved from a concept that was once vague and undefined into something that is central to how industries like mining operate today. The podcast underlined that the journey towards sustainable development required integrating local realities with global standards, fostering inclusive processes, and focusing on human capital investment for long-lasting impact. As they both pointed out, there's still so much work to be done, especially when it comes to finding that balance between local needs and global pressures.
I was particularly struck by the emphasis on building sustainable relationships at the ground level. It's clear that whether we are talking about environmental standards or community engagement, the real progress happens when all stakeholders, governments, companies, and communities come together and have a voice at the table. Glenn and Luke have given us so much to think about.
So thanks again to Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson, our stars, for sharing their knowledge with us today. And of course, a big thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We hope this episode has sparked new ideas and a deeper understanding around sustainability. Until next time, keep thinking critically and stay engaged with the conversations that shape our world.
In our next episode, we turn our attention to the artisanal mining sector, a part of the industry that often operates in the shadows. What role does artisanal mining play in global supply chains? And how can we support the formalization of this sector to ensure fair working conditions and environmental sustainability? We will delve into the evolving challenges in mining, particularly the social license, indigenous rights, and the need for sustainable practices.